countries into the group of rich countries, that policy is not going to work. It hasn't worked for 150 years, and I don't see any evidence that the heavens are going to change just because some bright theorist comes along and say, let's promote middle-income growth countries. It ain't going to work. That's the first conclusion I draw. And that's quite an important thing, because it's, when you look at the heavens as a whole, as opposed to a bit of it, you begin to understand how nutty are policies that only look at one tiny part of it. That's the first thing. But the second thing is to look at what the effect of globalisation, as it's called, has actually been. And what do I mean by globalisation? Well, my definition is going to be, I think it really refers to a period in which certain policies were adopted. And the policies were that the structural development programmes, the World Bank and the IMF from 1982 onwards, which were adopted by most countries in the world, which said you should flexibilise your labour markets, liberalise trade and liberalise above all your capital markets. That was the biggest extent the market has ever known in the world, first of all. And it was the market. Anything that happened under that, you can't blame feudalism or sort of backward culture or anything like that. The world is fully capitalist, fully marketised. It's the market. That started promoting this big world market, including the market in capital, started in 1982. And I'm going to take the period 1982 to 2002 as the period of greatest extent of globalisation. And I'm going to compare this with the 2 decades beforehand. So, 2 big divisions of the world and 2 periods of history. Now, I'm going to look first of all at the population of those countries, and then at their income. And I'm going to look at 20 years before globalisation started, the beginning of globalisation, and 20 years after. This is the, I'm going to call them the poor countries, okay, or the South. In 1962, that was 78% of the population of the world. Because this group has not changed its geographical extent, and because demographically population growth in the rich countries is less than in the poor countries, this has become a steadily smaller part of the population of the world. So 20 years before globalisation, this was just over a fifth. At the start of globalisation, just under a fifth, and really down to a sort of sixth by the time we get to 2002. Income of the rich countries, the opposite. 4/5 in 1962, just under 4/5 in 1982, so it's improved from here to here, and back where it was. So the share of income of the rich countries gets down a bit just before globalisation, then basically goes back to where it was. Now, because of the combination that they occupy a smaller part of the population of the world, but a constant part, or in some cases shrinking part, so a growing part of the income of the world, we can construct an index, which is what I call my inequality index. And this is simply the average income of the North divided by the average income of the South. So you just take the GDP of each group, you divide it by the population, and that's the GDP per head. Money made per year per person. In 2002, to fix your ideas, in the North, that was $27,000 per year. So on average, each person in the rich part of the world makes $27,000 per year, receives in income $27,000 per year in 2002. In the poor countries, again in 2002, that was about 1,500. Divide one by the other, and we have a figure which gives the relative inequality of the rich and the poor, which is 20 times richer. Now, what's important about that, that's not been constant. We get a different result depending on whether we include China or not. I just want to point that out because China makes a difference, so I don't want you to think I'm saying China makes no difference. It does make a difference. But I'm going to focus on including China at the beginning, so we look at the whole of the world. So, in the 20 years before globalisation, this inequality index remained constant, and in the next 20 years it nearly doubled. So the principal effect of globalisation, as I've called it, is to double the inequality between the historically poor section of the world, 4/5 of it, and the 1/5 of the world which is rich. That's the actual effect of it. And in my opinion, nothing is to blame for that but the market. All right? under the development economists in the 60s and 70s, there's a lot of debate about whether sort of forced labour, primitive forms of land ownership, backward culture, pre-capitalist formations, all sorts of things were made to say, you know, it's not really capitalism, therefore what you need is more capitalism. This was capitalism. This is the most capitalism you're ever going to get in the world. And the effect of it was to double the inequality in the world and to place it at that's the highest historical level that inequality in the world has ever reached. What I'm going to talk about next is growth. Because one of the things that the neoliberals say is the price you pay for growth is inequality. So this is all very well. The inequality will sort itself out, but we've had growth. The crucial point I want to make is that we haven't had growth. And that's rather important because a big claim of the globalisers is that one of the things we got out of globalisation was growth. So, let's hope. Fingers crossed. Nothing's happening at all. Here we go. Nothing's happening up there. There we go. Right. Now I show you what's supposed to happen. All these things, beautiful animations are supposed to come in. All failed a bit, just so you don't rely on technology. All right. So in summary, in 1982 the income of the advanced countries was 13 times larger in proportion to population than the rest of the world. By 2002 this had risen to 20. What about growth? Well, the average rate of growth during the 20 years before globalisation was 5%. And after globalisation it was 2.5%. So growth halved. Inequality doubled and growth halved. Now, what's the effect of that? In a sense, these are the two big figures. These are the figures that matter, because they're huge figures. In the 50s, you had a period which many economists and sociologues and politologues refer to as the long boom. The world was getting very significantly richer. The average income of a citizen of the world rose in real terms between 1950 and 1970 from $3,000 a year to $6,000 a year. That was a very big transformation because all the debates in the 50s were about whether there was enough food in the world to feed its population. It was a sort of Malthusian discussion. Are we really going to be able to produce enough? Population growth was the biggest problem. Limit population in case there's too many people for all the food we're going to produce. By 1970 it was already clear there was absolutely enough to go around. For $6,000 a year, you can't have a wonderful income. You can have an income 4 times better than the average income now in the South. Okay? And it's probably politically very difficult to accept most people in the North to accept that their income would be quadrupled, would be cut to a quarter. But if you did, they wouldn't die, they wouldn't suffer. They would have a decent life. You could have a pension, you could have medical care, you could have education. You could provide human rights in material terms for everybody on the planet already in 1970. And that was because of a very prolonged period of growth after the war. You couldn't have done that before the Second World War. Big historical change. All right. You had growing inequality, a little bit of growing inequality, but you had world growth. So what you had was the rich countries were going like that, if you like, in terms of the graph of growth of time, and the poor countries were going like that. So at least they were getting better off. So people would say, well, the problem is one of catch-up. We're not doing as well as the North, and in time we'll find out, we'll get their advanced technology, and we'll do better and we'll catch up. What's happening now is this. The rich countries are doing that, and the poor countries are doing that. If you have flat growth or stagnation, and rising inequality, that means an absolute decline in terms of the average living standards of the poor countries in the world. Now I want to put that within limits because there's a very big problem, which I acknowledge, of how you measure what's called real income. The food that money buys probably is not falling so much, but there is a lot of evidence, which I'm going to produce, that there are some pretty terrible things going on the poverty front with that.